Hello and welcome again to another episode of Vintage Pens for the Modern User. Today we are going to explore something that is often what draws many modern users to explore vintage pens, and that is pens with flexible nibs. The flex nib craze is certainly something most users are aware of, and the seeking out and finding of a really good quality flex pen can often be the pursuit of many who are looking for some very expressive writing. Vintage pens offer a level of expressivity with flex that I think no modern pen today really can compare with. And so we're going to dive in. This is not a model specific video, this is a nib specific video. So we're going to dive in and we're going to take a look at some of the qualities that vintage flex has to offer and give you some pointers, and we're going to test some pens, of course. So please join me as we explore vintage flex.
So today's video is all about the nibs, all about vintage flex, and so there's going to be less history and less detail. I provide some of that in other videos that I make. The brief overview when you're looking for vintage flex is that you're going to want to look early, and so I'm talking pens from the start of the 20th century, the 1900s, through the 1920s. There was some continuation of that beyond the 1930s. I'm speaking primarily about pens that are made here in the United States, although certainly you can find pens made outside the country, and you might find the US pen makers who made pens in Canada or in the UK, sometimes finding those export pens or those pens manufactured by US names in other countries. They actually may have more flexibility even later on into the 40s, 50s, and possibly 60s. So let's dive in. I'm going to start off right away with a pen that many people probably know and seek when they're looking for vintage flex, and that is an early Waterman. This is a Waterman 52, and they have great nibs. I've demonstrated this pen in a previous video before. Since I'm going through many pens, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail to show you how to fill the pen. I'm mostly going to show you what the nibs are all about. This is the lever filling pen, and the mechanism and all of that can be explored at other places at other times. So today, just dipping pens and showing you a little bit about what these vintage flex nibs can do. Of course, when you dip a pen, you want to get all the ink out of it. I'm a lefty, and so I don't write typically this way. I write over, but for the purpose of demonstration, we all know that using a flex nib generally works best when you write under the pen. And so an upstroke is a nice thin stroke with really no pressure on it. And a downstroke, you're pulling towards yourself. You're pulling into the paper slightly. I always tell people it's pulling, not pushing. Upstrokes are actually where you're pushing the pen. You don't push down on a nib to get it to flex. You pull towards yourself, and the nib, of course, does the work. So that's Waterman 52. You can find a lot of different nibs. Do not be fooled into thinking just because it's a Waterman 52 that it will inevitably be flexible. That may not be the case. Let's see if I can write Waterman 52 here, even though I've wiped the nib, so we can keep track. Oh, see, wipe the nib and get a little ink blot here. We'll get it finished out. Waterman 52. So there we have the Waterman 52. Waterman probably the most prominently sought because they made quite a few of those pens, and so you can find them easily. Another maker from the early era of fountain pens was the Wall pen, also known as Wall Eversharp. Early on, they were two different they were two different marketing, the Eversharp pencil and the Wall pen. Same company, but marketed. So you can find, I find often Walls have some very delightful nibs in them. And again, it's all about being under and letting the nib do the work. And you'll notice the difference here. This pen actually has nicer hairlines than the Waterman's. If I'm very light on my upstrokes, I have some very thin, but you'll notice on my downstrokes, I'm not as broad. But that's okay. You're still going to get wonderful variation in your writing. And that's kind of the point of Vintage Flex is these pens are very unique and they're each going to do their own thing the way they want to do it. So you don't want to push them beyond what they're actually capable of doing. And for those of you who are righties, blessings on you, because this is by far easier, but I do know actually several left-handed people that grew up learning to write under, and this is no problem for them either. So this would be a challenge for those of you who are overriders, but challenges can be overcome, and I encourage you to explore it and see what you can do. Moving quickly through here again, I'm going to go to early Schaefers. Companies like Schaefers and Parker, who were some of the early companies to talk about lifetime warranties on their pens, particularly their nibs. As a result of those warranties, they sort of deviated away from flexible nibs because they are more delicate nibs. However, if you find yourself an early Schaefer, you will be very pleased and very surprised. Some of these can be some of the most responsive and flexible nibs, in fact, that I've found. So here we go, vintage Schaefers. This one really, it goes so quick. The vintage Schaefer's feed sometimes did not really keep up well with the flexibility of the nib. That's one pitfall that they have. And so you can see I'm getting a lot of railroading and running out. If I had inked this pen, if I had a sack in it and inked it, I can imagine it would be quite a delightful writer. But again, upstrokes, light, no pressure. Downstrokes is not pushing, it's pulling towards yourself. And that is what gives you that nice expressiveness in your writing. If you're accustomed to doing this already, I think you'll find that these are some exquisite pens. So here is a Schaefers. This is an early Schaefers, probably from the early 1920s, possibly even earlier than that, though I doubt. Too much earlier, 1917 maybe, but delightful. So we've got three so far that are prominent US makers. I've talked about these three makers before when I talk about the big five. Let's do one more out of that category that I talked about here. This is an early Conklin, the Conklin crescent filling mechanism. All three pens I've shown so far were lever filling mechanisms, which have been explained. Crescent filling mechanism, still a sack inside. You turn a lock ring and the crescent falls into the pen, and well, it won't fall in if there's a sack in. You'd press it in and then it'd return itself. So let's see what this little Conklin can do. It's a little bit of a tiny pen, but here we go. Now, some of these early pens, if you find the hard rubber is faded and the chasing is missing, well, that's where you find the deal. Okay, so again, lightly up, heavy down. You can really make these pens do some amazing things. And it's about learning. This is pushing here. I'm going up when I push there. When I go down, that's pulling. Oopsies, didn't tip the bottle. Here we go again. Again, when they're restored and they have sacks, there's, ample amounts of ink for you to do whatever you desire. So here we have a Conklin. Conklin crescent filler. This pen is actually missing probably part of the cap lip. It's hard to tell with this cap band here. So again, when you find these early pens and you're willing to accept some minuscule flaws, like perhaps a cap lip has been trimmed down, or it's heavily faded, or it's heavily chased, that's a great user pen, okay? The nib hasn't been affected at all. And as I always say, of course, you want to find something that's been restored. Since the ink's wet on this paper, rather than turning the page, I'm just going to shift over and use my left-hand side of the page here. Only two more quickly to show here. Pen that you may be familiar with are Maybe Todd pens. Maybe Todd made three tiers of pens: the Maybe Todd Swan, the Maybe Todd Blackbird, and the Maybe Todd Swallow. The Swan was their top. I'm not exactly sure where the Swallow and Blackbird fell in terms of which one was placed slightly above the other, but this is a Maybe Todd Blackbird. Another lever filler. So once you make that plunge into lever filling pens, then you're ready to go with a lot of these great vintage flex pens. So here's a Maybe Todd Blackbird. Again, simple pens, simple hard rubber pens, but often found with some rather delightful nibs. And you just let the nib do what it's going to do. So again, this one, much like the Wall, has very thin hairlines. It's a very extra fine, and it's not quite as flexible as perhaps the Waterman's was, and perhaps the Schaefer's or even Conklin was. But it's capable, and taking your time, learning how to sort of make that balance between your very light upstrokes and your pulling in on the downstrokes. You don't push these nibs. Pushing these nibs damages them. Again, the upstroke is the light part where you're actually pushing the nib away from you, but there's no pressure at all. And when you're going towards you, you're not pushing, you're actually pulling. And that is what allows the tines to separate as it goes into the paper. So this is we'll do Maybe Todd, MT for short, Blackbird. And the last pen on my list of pens here is sometimes what you'll find known as a Franken pen. And so these are things that sometimes restorers churn out for themselves, hobbyists churn out for themselves, accepting flaws and everything, but looking for a nib. So this started its life as a Conklin crescent filler. It's very badly worn and chased, and in fact, this pen was completely broken. There's a crack that runs through, and the barrel was broken into two pieces. This is my own hobby pen. I restored it fusing those two pieces together. There's actually a brass sleeve inside the pen to help kind of give some structure to that fused repair. And it didn't have its original nib, and a friend had a warranted 14 karat gold nib with quite a special, flexible, unique quality to it. This is a music nib. And so music nibs, instead of having 2 tines, they had 3 tines. And they often, though not always, were slightly broad. So your cross strokes this way without any pressure, and your downstrokes this way without any pressure were sort of naturally done that way. The upstrokes and the downstrokes, when they're chiseled, might be about the same. But you can see if I get a nice cross pattern and down, I've got not enough ink because I haven't filled the pen really fully, but you get light on the cross, big and full on the down, and this is about as wet and about as much fun as you can really have. Vintage music nibs, if you find them, they're expensive, but this one is a vintage warranted music nib. And so again, it's not a named music nib. It's not a Waterman music nib. And so as a result, or I don't even know all the makers that made them, maybe Todd probably. Schaefer's I know did. And so finding a warranted music nib, you're not going to have to pay as much as you would if it was a named music nib, but you can have as much fun as you can clearly see here. And if you're willing to accept a pen where the purpose of this pen is purely the writing joy of the nib that's in it. We're not looking at aesthetic beauty here. The beauty is what you can do with the nib on the page, which I'm sure many of you out there watching this are capable of far more than I. One final note, when you're shopping around for vintage flex, please know what you're doing. If you're used to modern flexible nibs, they require much more pressure, and these vintage flex nibs do not require that level of pressure in order for them to work. If the nib is not flexing, it doesn't want to flex, okay? It doesn't need to be forced to flex. If you're forcing flex, then you're damaging the nib. So vintage flex, it goes on its own power, it goes where it will, and you don't go beyond that. Also be advised, when you see writing samples of vintage flex pens, you may see some very elegant things and think, well, all I have to do is buy that pen and I can write like that. Well, Not necessarily, but if you are a competent person who's learned to do this, yes, you can. But even your normal script, if you're used to writing under and you're used to writing cursive, normal script can be wonderfully transformed by Vintage Flex. So I hope you've enjoyed this overview of Vintage Flex. And if that's something that attracts you, there's some great people out there that give an overview. There's a wonderful Facebook page, just to do a quick plug, on Vintage Flex fountain pens. And there's a lot of wonderful resource and material and some good collectors and hobbyists in there that kind of help those looking for Vintage Flex find their way. So thank you and happy writing, everyone.